Sport is now the only potential discipline where you can engage very high numbers of people. Not my words, the words of the Vice President for Marketing at Nissan Europe. He was speaking before the pandemic, but generally, world-class sport and the power it has to generate interest and cash has come out stronger from COVID. This is Great British Bosses, the podcast from Anything But Footy, where we speak to the men and women behind the success of sports in the UK at all levels. I'm Michael.
And I'm John, and in this episode we're joined by one of the UK's most successful sports marketing agents to talk all things off the court, pitch, venue. He works with world-class athletes and world-class brands, bringing them together while ensuring the athlete and their performance comes first.
Hi there, I'm Matt Gentry, so long-time agent of Andy Murray, and we also have a business together, 77 Sports Management, which looks after the careers of up-and-coming tennis players and footballers.
So Matt, the first question has to be, firstly, how do you become an agent? But also, how do you become an agent to Britain's leading sports star for the past decade?
I actually started my career working in a bank and soon realised that wasn't for me. So from there, I ended up doing some sort of work experience at a sports sponsorship agency and sort of started again from that point and was lucky enough there to work on some sport clients, Adidas in particular, a lot of their work around football sponsorship, but also rugby, athletics, other clients, Pepsi, so some really nice sort of big blue chip brands. And that really sort of set the scene, I guess, and gave me that valuable experience. From there, I went on to a company called 19, which is owned by Simon Fuller. And that's when I joined there in 2009 when they signed Andy. They'd already had David Beckham there. And then we signed Lewis Hamilton a few years later. So from a sort of talent management perspective, it was a pretty decent showing from UK, actually global athletes. 4 or 5 years there, then I left with Andy to set up his own management agency, 77 Management. He and pre me, hopefully, I take that for granted when he says this, but he worked with a few agents and agencies and just didn't really like the way they were set up. The way that in his mind, it was about them making money and commercializing things ahead of putting the athlete first. He always feels, and as we do, and rightly so, that the athlete should be put at the center of everything, and then money there is to be made, but it's sort of made in the longer term once you're doing the right things by the athlete, and not the other way around. So so that took a couple of years to set up. A business partner joined us, Wayne Davies, who was ex-Lagardère, ex-IMG. And between the two of us and Andy, we sort of then forged this business in the sort of, the mindset of actually, trying to do things properly, working with younger athletes, having a real duty of care to the athletes, really getting, engaged in how they're developing, and looking at everything they do away from the pitch, away from the court in terms of nutrition, psychology, all the really important building blocks that help get them. And at that point, then you start looking at, away from the pitch, how then do you build a brand and just putting into learning some of the stuff we've gone through. So that's been a journey. I think, back to the original question, how do you become one? I think it's probably perseverance. I think determination, perseverance is the key. There were lots of, I actually remember it quite vividly, and I get lots of sort of people emailing, asking for jobs, and it's just having a list of agencies or companies or that you're just regularly in contact with, and badgering in a nice way, but just really pushing the cause and offering to help, offering to do work experience, just volunteering your services to get your foot in the door, and then you're sort of in there. But it's such a competitive space that you need to sort of try and stand out at that early stage. So it's not easy, and there's lots and lots of no's and rejections to it, but you sort of get there in the end.
The name of our podcast obviously suggests that we don't really talk too much about football, but we do obviously mention it because it's such a massive sport that generates so much coverage in this country. And I think most people know agents from football agents, and they don't have the best rep in the world, do they?
They don't. I mean, look, there are lots of good ones, by the way. It's difficult. I mean, I think the lack of regulation at the moment in the market doesn't help. I think you also get a lot of family members and friends of footballers who are working in that space, which is great from one element in terms of the sort of trust and everything else. But in terms of expertise, maybe, sometimes, that's not conducive to, the best outcome, really. So you tend to find sort of a lot of the cases like a hybrid model of maybe a lawyer and a family member, potentially with an agent coming in just to sort of consult around certain things. So, the way we approach it, we haven't got lots of footballers, and we wouldn't bring on lots of footballers. It's more working with a smaller group of people you can actually get involved with and actually have an effect on what they do, rather than stockpiling 30 players and hoping one or two of them make it through and then to sort of hang on the coattails, which I guess some people do. It just doesn't feel right from a sort of human aspect for us.
Matt, we think of you as being a very good agent. And the reason that we say that on this podcast is we email you quite a lot. Usually it's, can we get Andy Murray on the podcast? And you email back and go, no. But you always email back. And that's not something that's universal in your industry. But I'm interested how you get your roster. Do people come to you and say, I would like you to represent me? Or do you go to them and say, we would like to represent you?
I think it's probably, depending on the level of talent. I mean, I think that the top talent, I think you'll always have to, go to them and actually make a convincing case as to how you can help and why they should appoint you, right? So I think, you're very lucky if people are landing in your lap. Well, it does happen. It happens through, if you have footballers, maybe that it's a friend of the footballer or someone in the dressing room, the player you work with then recommends you and it comes through that way. So that's great. But, a lot of the time with the bigger, guys or girls, it's you have to approach them and actually have a very solid sort of business plan rationale as to why they should work with you, because there's a lot of competition out there. There's if you think in the football space, there's sort of three very big agencies. And then you sort of, look around sport tennis, for example, there's these sort of big IMGs, the Octagons, so there's a lot of competition. And there's also a lot more boutique agencies setting up now. So it's not just the big guys you can sort of compete against and differentiate yourself and talk about, how we do stuff. And it's more of a family, and there are other agencies of a similar size doing it. So it's certainly not easy.
This is a podcast called Great British Bosses, and you're on, Andy's not. Are you the boss?
No, I certainly am not the boss. I know, and arguably people who work with me may dispute the great part to that as well. It's interesting, just having working extensively in football and tennis, the sort of team sport versus individual sport dynamic is very noticeable. So tennis players, who I would argue that probably have it toughest, maybe with boxers, but actually out there in terms of having to do everything themselves to sort of almost pay their way as they work through, and the pressures on them to perform or die, and probably die in the case of boxing. But actually, you're out there, it's gladiatorial. It's interesting. We had name dropping a bit, but Jose Mourinho is a big tennis fan, and he likes Andy, and he's watched quite a few matches, and just chatting with him in the box at one of the matches. And he said, I'd love to be able to get my footballers to come and, swap places with a tennis player, who's having to, maybe he's not feeling great or battling injury, and he's out there trying to earn money, trying to earn ranking points, or he gets nothing at the end of the day. He said, a lot of footballers would crumble, fairly or unfairly, in that situation. So it's really, so a lot of tennis players you find are really, really driven. So back to the question, I wouldn't be the boss, but, actually, to be fair, he's pretty chilled out, despite, I guess maybe how he comes across sometimes. He's pretty relaxed and lets me get on with stuff. He's a smart guy, so we talk about things, but he's pretty hands off.
And the fact that you struck up this partnership, you guys must have the same principles, effectively, as in, as you said at the start, we want it to be putting the performance first. ahead of the marketing side of it. Does that then go to the players you look after? So you're looking for those kind of personalities as well. Let's mention a couple like Katie Swan, Harriet Dart, the tennis players, and Caroline Weir, the Man City and Scotland footballer.
Yeah, I think it does. I think, it comes down to due diligence as well. So when you're trying to sign players, it's important that actually you sort of, you speak to them a lot, you speak to family members, and actually, making sure there is chemistry there, making sure, they buy into the vision. Ultimately for us, it's around the sort of player development piece and around, so I think, we sort of almost present a vision, and I think, that either works for them or it doesn't. And if it doesn't, then they're probably not right for us anyway. So, I just think we're sort of quite careful and selective. It probably means we don't sign as many players. But again, it sort of goes back to actually, well, we don't really want an agency with, 30 or 40 athletes, because then it sort of dilutes, what we're offering, as an agency and as sort of individuals working on that.
And you said you're not the boss of Andy, but with those other players and athletes you represent, I'm assuming you're kind of their boss along with their coach.
It may be just the way that I approach it, but it's, I've always been relatively, I would never sort of scream and shout, or actually with talent, you sort of, over the years, I've sort of focused a bit, you work with them and you sort of present them ideas and say, look, this is how it will work. This is what I think will happen, if we don't do this, and this is what you do. But ultimately the decision is theirs, right? It's their career. So you're an advisor, you're giving advice, that's what you're being paid for, but they need to be the ones in ultimate control of their career.
In terms of your skill set, finance, legal advice, commercial opportunities, firefighter, gatekeeper, what are the skills that are needed to be a good agent, Matt?
There's a lot of them, really. My wife will tell you I'm a sort of jack of all trades, which is probably probably a bit unfair, but you tend to have to be a good at everything, and actually, as new things come on the scene, actually upskill yourself pretty quickly. So, sort of case in point, we've done a fair bit of work around NFTs over the last year or so, and we're going to do some more of that. Now, a year ago, I'd have no idea what one of those was, or how it would impact on what I'm doing, but actually you need to understand it, because that could be potentially quite a lucrative, revenue stream for athletes. So you need to understand it, and then, okay, how does that work with some of our talent? Can we introduce this? So you have to sort of constantly evolve as well. So it's challenging in that respect, but it's, I enjoy that part of the job. I enjoy learning new things and new areas. So it's, you just have to sort of do a bit of, you end up working with, good agencies. So, we have, a good lawyer that we use, some good accountancy firms that we sort of lean on. So again, it's just knowing other experts and building a sort of trusted network.
Does your phone go 24/7 though?
It has periods where it goes quite a bit. Yeah, I mean, I did a talk a little while ago at a sixth form, and they were sort of quizzing me on, sort of day to day, and I said it's certainly not if you're looking for a 9 to 5 job where you can sort of tuck your phone away at the end of the day and at the weekend switch off. It's not that. So you find yourself sort of doing obscure phone calls at 6 a.m. or 11 p.m. at night, with certain parts of the world, around maybe something new commercially or a tournament or whatever. It's a challenge in that, but I don't mind that. You sort of, in this line of work, you have to sort of be able to juggle quite frequently, and plans and things change quite frequently. So, but I don't mind that.
We're catching up with Matt Gentry, the co-founder of 7/7 Sports Management, as part of Anything But Footy's Great British Bosses series. And we'll probably broaden it out, Matt, and talk a little bit about the issues facing sport to come. But I wanted a couple of quick questions about you again. What should have been your biggest success, would you say, with 7/7? Is it 7/7 or 77? Sorry.
Well, so 77. So 77 is the sort of management. I mean, it's quite complicated in that looks after Andy, and then we have a 77 Sports Management, which looks after our younger talent. So, but in effect, I guess to the general public, they're probably one and the same. Biggest success, I think, and I guess it's not really my success. You sort of share in the success of the athletes. So whatever they're doing, and you play that sort of very small part in helping them sort of get there. So I think, if we're looking sort of towards Andy, it's probably one of the sort of big wins, probably the Wimbledon win 2013. I think probably is the sort of big moment, I guess, from his career. And it was just amazing just to be around, having seen all the sort of hard work that had gone in previously to that. From his perspective, it was just so I will steal that, his moment of success, and claim that as my own.
And are you a fan of all the sports that you manage? I think you do a bit of athletics, some of the sprinters, you mentioned football and obviously tennis. Do you play? Does it matter? Do you sometimes offer advice?
I played football. I've played football for 30 years, not to a particularly great level. Tennis, I'm terrible at tennis. Paddle. Actually, paddle's an interesting sport. So we're getting into that as well. And that will be one that really grows over the next few years. So for people who are not familiar, it's sort of a combination of tennis and squash, played on a much smaller court with perspex sides, but it's a much easier game to pick up and a lot more sociable. So I've started playing that of late. Does it help? I think it probably helps, to understand the industry a little bit. I think, not necessarily playing to a great level, but I think it helps. It doesn't necessarily help from a sort of work perspective. I think sometimes, if you're sort of, a big fan of a sport, sometimes that can knock the objectivity a little bit, and you have to sort of remove yourself from it. So from a sort of health, wellness, fitness point of view, yes, I'm big into my sports, and my sort of family, kids, play lots and lots of sports, and I think I've seen the power of a sport over the years and the good things that it does. I would be encourage that a lot, but I don't think you necessarily have to be a fan, but it helps.
What's the most ridiculous request that's ever landed in your inbox for one of your big stars?
Apart from us asking for Andy every other week.
You must get them.
There's a lot of requests that come in, so you tend to erase them quite quickly from your mindset.
And I was just wondering, is Andy Murray a brand now? He's one of the senior statesmen of British sport. He has something to say, whether that's around gender equality, whether that's donating money to Ukraine at the moment. Is he a brand now more than the individual?
Yeah, I think he would be. I think he probably has been for a while. It's interesting, sort of, how do you define, if someone is a brand or not in terms of an athlete? Is it, do they have to have won a certain amount of things, or, is their profile need to be of a certain size, or social media following, whatever? I think, all of these athletes now have such, big, some of the top tier athletes have such, such powerful positions, and they're, and rightly so, held up, I think, as, role models. And I think, what they say and do carries a lot of weight. I think he probably wouldn't like to sort of see himself as a brand. That's just not who he is. He's quite a private guy. He's quite low key. But yes, ultimately, he is, and he's got quite a few commercial partners and everything else. So yeah, I would say he's been a brand probably for quite a while.
And then when you're marketing a brand, does it help, hinder when they are honest and come out and say things that you might not necessarily want them to say as an agent?
Good question. So years ago, I would have said that the advice was probably, say nothing, be vanilla, and then therefore you won't offend anyone. So from a sponsorship angle, that would probably work. I think the shift over the last couple of years, and you've seen this with, whether it's Sterling talking about racism or Marcus Rashford around, some great work they guys were doing. It's actually now people almost expect an opinion, and actually brands, it's part of the, is what they're buying into. They want someone to have a view on something. So I think it's great. It's really refreshing, and I think it's a nice. And so actually now athletes and talent can speak freely. It's a tough, Twitter or Facebook or anywhere. It's a pretty vile place, when you do view an opinion. But I think it's much more accepted now. And I think that's a good thing. I think, why shouldn't people have views on things? You might not agree with them, and that's absolutely fine. And Andy's always been of that opinion as well. He doesn't necessarily, he has an opinion about things, and if people don't agree, then that's fine. As long as you're sort of respectful around that, then no issue.
I wonder whether there is too much pressure though on sportsmen and women to offer an opinion if they don't want to. I sometimes think, Matt, and I've spoken to this with my father a few times. I don't know if I brought it up with Michael before, but I have a feeling that the world of football and the world of sport has replaced the church in a lot of people's lives in this country in the last 50 or 60 years, where if something bad happened, you would go to the church way back for an opinion on something or some help. Now, anything that goes wrong or any help is required or any opinion that is needed, it seems like we ask a sportsman, or we ask footballers to do something, or we ask for people not to compete in certain countries. Is it fair on literally 19, 20-year-olds that we put so much pressure on them?
Yeah, I mean, it is tricky. And, I guess Andy has the benefit of experience and hindsight, So, and, he can speak quite freely about stuff and he doesn't really mind the repercussions. I think, go back to the start of his career, it'd be very different. I think, so yeah, I do think there is a lot of pressure, placed on it. And it's something we do as an agency. We're quite, careful with our talent and sort of, help them through it because it is a minefield, not quite knowing what to say or what you should have an opinion on, not wanting to offend certain people. It's all new to some of it. So they definitely need the right sort of advice and guidance at that early part in their career. And I think we talked about it a bit earlier off podcast that, as sometimes, and it feels unfair at times that sport is held to a higher standard than any other sort of industry, and I'm not quite sure why that is.
It was interesting, wasn't it? During, say, the start of the pandemic, politicians were suggesting that Premier League footballers should be donating a portion of their wages to the NHS, but they weren't making the same call to a Russian oligarch, for example.
Yeah, I was reading around. Some of the politicians were questioning, Saudi Arabia and investment in Newcastle, and yet, I think a football fan of them posted something back saying, well, actually, you sell $11 billion worth of arms to Saudi Arabia each year. Why is there no sort of spotlight on that? What's the difference? And obviously there is a bit of difference, but it's not a sort of a black and white argument, really, is it? There's a bit of nuance to it.
And did Andy always have his voice, or has he found his voice? Because he has been outspoken on issues. He has spoken about things beyond, what he does on a tennis court. Has he always had that voice, or has it come with experience and success?
I think he's always had that voice. I think, especially around the area of gender equality, I think, that's a very natural positioning for him. So that's not something we're saying to him, I think we should say this or that. He's very sort of comfortable with that and feels it's just a very straightforward issue that, people should be judged, basically on merit rather than sex or, gender, story, should I say, or race or whatever. So, that's quite a natural, easy position for him. I think he's always had it. I just think he's probably, the more tennis players as well, don't forget. So they probably do about 80 press conferences a year. So they do them before each tournament starts and then after each match. So he's had a hell of a lot of practice. He's definitely finessed that over the years. He doesn't necessarily enjoy doing it lots, but I think, he always gives, and I speak to the journalists there, and he always gives pretty thoughtful, insightful answers to questions that are put to him, and tends to be, on the right side of things in the answers he gives. And that's just, I think that's just because he's actually, fundamentally a nice, decent human being.
We talked about the negative side of maybe the amount of coverage that sport gets, but we started this podcast by saying that sport really is the only thing that brings everyone together, can engage people. I mean, from a marketing point of view, is sport still the cash cow?
I think so. I mean, I'm pretty biased in it because I work in the industry. So I probably would say yes, but I think so. I mean, I just, having played it as well, I just think the power of sport, and not necessarily sort of the top end of sport. It's just the, playing as part of a team and, all of that it brings together in terms of sort of teamwork, all of the vital skills that it sort of brings. It's just, I've just sort of, seen and reaped the benefits of that from, my entire life. So it's just, something that I, feel, that is a good thing. And, I say I get my kids to try and, play as many different sports as they can, just to try out and find which ones they like, which ones they enjoy doing. It doesn't necessarily matter how good they are at it, but I just think there's so many benefits sport can bring from a health, and a sort of psychological point of view.
And business has bounced back post-COVID?
I think so. And I think, I think, sports sort of now has resumed, it seems, sort of a normal calendar or getting very close to getting back to that. So I think, there's sort of a bit of pent up demand. So it feels to me that, while, from a tennis perspective, maybe events will be run in a slightly different way. It definitely feels like the crowds are returning, and, the sort of finance side of it is the same. And I think, football, which is, as you say, I think the fact that it was away for a period of time, sort of people then appreciate it a bit more, maybe, and appreciate meeting up with people and going to games. It feels like it.
A couple of questions about the future, Matt. Obviously, as an agency, you've broadened beyond just being, Andy Murray's agency. So is that the plan, just to continue with your roster, a manageable roster, the right roster, like you've spoken about? Yeah,
I think so. And then, looking at other areas, whether we're looking into a sort of, production arm where we get into sort of, having a sort of studio as part of it as well. So, I think that's interesting. I think you've seen the sort of rise over the last few years of documentaries, and so I think that's a powerful tool for athletes to tell their story once they're sort of at a certain level. So that's interesting for us. I think the rise of crypto and NFT, I think is interesting, and athlete tokens, fan tokens. I think again there'll be areas that come up in the next few years, which are just people are learning about them slowly but surely. But there's definitely revenue opportunities available for athletes on that. So I think things like that will be exciting. A sport like paddle, for example, it's rare that you sort of get new sports that come in, but I'm really bullish on that, actually, and not just because we've invested in a paddle company. I'll just throw that out there, but I just think it will catch on. It's sort of huge. I think it's just behind football in Spain as the second biggest sport. It's big in Italy now. It's big in sort of some of the Scandinavian countries. The UK only has about 150 courts at the moment, but there'll be thousands of courts over the next few years. I'm sure of it. So I just think that's a sport to watch, and that'll be interesting.
I wish we had a bit more time to develop some of the themes that you've mentioned there, but I want to ask you about Andy's future as well, because I would totally understand if he just wanted to go and sit at home with his wife and his children and have a family life after years on the circuit, or if he wants to come and get under your feet in the office. But I feel he has more to give, not just to sport, but the wider world, than sitting in the BBC commentary box for 2 weeks every summer at Wimbledon. Do you agree?
Yeah, I think so. I don't imagine he will, be too heavily in. Actually, he did some BBC work, and he watched the Del Potro match at Wimbledon a couple of years ago, and it was 5 hours, and he said, "I'm never doing that again." So it's interesting because actually, even he, looking at the sport of tennis, I think he feels that actually it's probably too long. If you look at the sort of landscape now of viewing habits and of the younger generation coming through, I'm not sure many of them will be sat for 5 hours to watch a tennis match, right? So there is questions there about how the sport reinvents itself, as it competes with other sports, as it competes with Netflix and Amazon Prime and all of this stuff, right? Esports, gaming, there's lots of things that vie for people's attention. So, I think he'll coach at some point as well. I think he has a very good analytical mind. He's obviously won all the biggest things out there he can win. So I think he'll be very attractive to some of the younger players to sort of to lean on in future years. So I think that some of the mentoring side as well is important to him. So working with athletes, and not just in tennis. I just think there's commonality. He had lots of struggles as he grew up, to get to where he got to. I think there's things he can pass on and give back to British sport and to athletes and people, just in terms of whether it's dealing with pressure or media or just general development stuff. So I think that sort of stuff's of interest to him. I think who knows on the other sports. I think he really likes his football, so we might see some something in getting involved somewhere there at some point. I think he's in the nice position of being able to have a think and sort of choose the areas. We've been busy building a lot of businesses around what we've got at the moment. So he's invested in quite a few startups. So early stage companies, generally within sort of sport, tech, health, wellness. So he's got quite a good business brain. So he actually might want to get a bit more hands on with some of those. And that is a bit of a trend actually that tends to be, whereas years ago it was just sort of athletes being paid to promote a certain sponsor. I think now with some of these sort of smaller companies coming through, athletes can actually get equity in the company, actually, a bit of skin in the game, and actually get involved in the day-to-day business, especially when they have time and finish playing. So I think that's an area that will also appeal to him.
And one more Wimbledon.
Be nice, wouldn't it?
You could claim glory as well, Matt. Get down there, hold up the trophy.
Yeah, he's done amazingly well to get back to where he is now, right? If you think he's competing once again at the top level, with a metal hip, he's had some rough draws, because when you're not seeded in tennis, you tend to then end up sort of drawing top players in the world early on in tournaments. So then it doesn't help you get the ranking points up. But he's back working in Lendl now. Where great mentor, very clear direction around what he wants and how and he's worked together with him before twice, so obviously knows what he's about. So I think given that, and he's actually sort of not defending any points for the rest of the year, which means his ranking should only go up. I think as long as the sort of injuries are at bay and it seems good at the moment, then I think why not? Who knows what the future holds? So.
Well, we wish him all the best. We wish you and all of your team at 77 Sports Management the best as well. Matt Gentry, thanks for talking to Great British Bosses.